Thank you, sir. Counsel?
Thank you, Honor. Good morning, Dr. Cahill.
Good morning.
Could you please give the jury a summary of your educational background?
Sure. So I earned my bachelor's degree in psychology at Illinois State University in 2005. I received a master's degree in experimental psychology from University of Colorado Springs in 2008, and then a PhD in legal psychology from Florida International University in 2015.
What is your current profession, Dr. Cahill?
I'm an associate instructional professor at the University of Florida.
And how long have you been a professor?
I was hired there in 2016, and then before that I was an adjunct professor at Florida International University for I think 3 or 4 years, something like that.
So how long have you been a professor?
About a decade now.
And what classes do you teach at the University of Florida currently?
So I regularly teach cognitive psychology, legal psychology, research methods. I've taught social psychology there and introductory to psychology, and I teach sensory processes every once in a while as well.
Have you testified in a court of law before?
I have. This, including today, is my 7th time, I believe.
And in what field do you consider your expertise?
So I'm a legal psychologist, which means it's a fancy way of saying I'm a social cognitive psychologist that applies that area of psychology to the legal system. Specifically, I study memory and decision making, particularly in a legal system avenue.
And speaking of memory, do people often hold false beliefs regarding memory?
Yes, they do.
Could you give the jury a couple of examples of false beliefs related to memory?
Sure. So 2 of the most basic findings from memory research comes back to Herbie Ebbinghaus, who's the father of memory research, is the exposure time, which is the idea that the longer time you have to view something, you'll remember more information. About let me look at my notes real quick, 39% or something around there get that question wrong. And then forgetting curve is another one. So forgetting curve is the idea that what we find is that you forget most of the information of an event, or not most, but a lot of it right after the event, and it slowly tapers off. So after a while, what gets into your memory is generally there for a while, but we do forget a lot quite quickly after the event. And about 35% or somewhere around there, people get that idea wrong as well.
So when you say people are getting that idea wrong, is it fair to say that people believe that you remember more than you actually do immediately after an event?
I'd say yes. So, and I'm talking about people who don't study this for a living, right? Laypersons. Related to that is another finding that laypersons typically believe that memory works like a DVD recorder, that we simply record everything that we encounter and then we store it as is and we can just recall it later on. If you've seen the movie Inside Out, it kind of represents that when they bring up the orb, in the brain with joy and whatnot. That's not how memory works. Memory is more like a Wikipedia page where you can go in and edit your own memories, and so can I. So it's not as accurate as some people believe it to be.
And can you explain to the jury what the difference is between retrospective memory and prospective memory?
Sure. So there's a few differences, but the main one that we care about is that the retrospective memory is remembering events and information from the past, and prospective memory is remembering to do something in the future. So prospective memory, think of it as more action-based. I have to remember to buy milk on the way home when I leave work, something like that. Whereas remembering my son's name is a retrospective memory. Remember playing with him last night is a retrospective memory, something like that.
And Dr. Cahill, I got a little ahead of myself. May I approach the witness, Your Honor?
You may.
Thank you. Cahill, I'm showing you what's previously been marked as Defense Exhibit B. Could you look at that, please?
Sure.
Do you recognize that?
It looks like my current CV.
And could you explain to the jury what a CV is?
It's my resume, basically.
And is that a fair and accurate representation of your education, your work, your writings, and other things associated with your profession as a psychologist?
Yes.
Your Honor, I will seek to move this in as Defense Exhibit 1.
Any objection?
No objection.
Very well, that will be received as Defense Exhibit 1.
Thank you, Your Honor. So, Dr. Cahill, going back to the retrospective versus prospective memory, retrospective memory, I think you said, is remembering things that have happened in the past or recalling information that you need, correct?
Correct.
And then prospective memory, could you explain that one more time for the jury, please?
Yeah, so prospective memory is remembering I have to do an action. I have to complete some task in the future. So, yeah.
Does prospective memory usually have 2 parts?
Yeah, so prospective memory in general is a task-demanding process that you engage in, because you're having to do everything you're doing while you're trying to remember that I have to do this in the future. Right? So I'm sending emails or working on something knowing that at some later point in time I have to do another task, right? So there's typically 2 parts to a prospective memory task. The first part is remembering that I have to do something, and then the second part is remembering what that was I have to do.
And are there different kinds of prospective memory?
So there's two main types, which is called event-based and time-based. So event-based would be I have to remember to buy milk on the way home. That would be an event-based one. Time-based would be I have to remember to go to the doctor at 3 p.m.
And how long has science or psychology studied prospective memory?
So we've talked about it in various ways since early 1900s, but with a term, prospective memory, and more focused study, about 1977 was when the first paper was done looking at prospective memory. So about 50 years ago now.
Would this be considered a well-established area of or field of study in psychology?
I would agree with that. Pretty much any introductory cognitive psychology textbook I've ever read has a chapter or information on prospective memory. I teach it every semester when I teach the class. Memory books and memory improvement books will have an entire chapter usually on prospective memory. Thousands of articles and stuff has been published on it. So I'd say it's generally accepted, yes.
And is the large majority of those articles you mentioned, have they been peer-reviewed?
Yes, so if you just look at peer-reviewed, I did a search a week or two ago, and when you just look for peer-reviewed articles in my largest database with prospective memory as a subject term, about 2,800 of those hits are peer-reviewed papers.
Could you explain to the jury what peer-reviewed means?
Peer-reviewed is I do a study or write a paper, and in order for me to get published, I have to have my peers who are experts in the field approve of my work, basically. Make sure it's valid and the methodology used is sound, so the conclusions I'm drawing are good, so we have good science.
So we've talked about the fact that prospective memory is basically the idea that you have to remember to do something in the future. Are there ever errors with prospective memory?
There are.
And when we say errors of prospective memory, what are we talking about?
So first off, I'd like to explain that, again, prospective memory is a hard process for people to do, relatively speaking. Our brains work really, really well. And all of us in the room are listening. We're trying to use our previous knowledge to understand what I'm saying. You're taking notes and whatnot. All of this is kind of done effortlessly. So we think that, everything we do is kind of really easy with our brain. But our brain's actually doing some really cool stuff right now. So when we're trying to remember to do something in the future, you're having to process the environment that you're in and remember to do this task. That's very cognitively demanding. And we only have so many resources in our brain to do some things at once. We've all experienced a failure when we try to do too many things at one time. So think of it in general, the more taxing I make a situation, anything I do to draw resources away is going to increase the likelihood that I make this kind of error, this prospective memory error.
And is a prospective memory error basically forgetting what you had planned to do in the future?
So there's two types. There's the experience where this is the less common one from the research, which is where I show up to the store and I say, I remember my wife told me I had to get something, but I just can't remember what it was. That's the first type. That's not as common. The second type is forgetting simply overall that I needed to do something. So I simply drive right by the store and go home. And then obviously my wife gets mad at me and tells me I have to go back to the store to get whatever she wanted me to get.
Have there been studies that have been conducted in the scientific field that discuss how often errors with prospective memory occur?
There have been.
Could you give the jury an example of one of those studies and its findings?
Yeah, so there's kind of a couple of different ways we can look at this. One is through diary studies. So we have participants keep a diary of their daily events for weeks or a month or whatnot. And then we have them write down, in this study, they had them write down any kind of memory error that they made, right? And then we coded that data later on. So these could have been a retrospective error. I forgot someone's name. That would be a retrospective memory error. Or it could be I forgot to turn in my paper for class. That would be a prospective memory error. And when they code this data of the memory errors people make, prospective memory errors are the most common form. They're about 50 to 80% of the time that someone makes a memory error, it is a prospective memory error. And then there's other research that looks at same kind of thing with diaries, and it has people write down how many events that they had to do that week. So in a given week, maybe someone had, I think it was on average about 13 things they had to do that week. So tasks in the future they had to complete. And then they had to write down like how many of those did you complete, how many did you not complete, and then of the ones that were not completed, they asked them why wasn't it done. And of those, 13, I think it was about 13% of the time, people forgot to do the task. That would be a prospective memory error. There was other reasons why they didn't complete the task. They rescheduled the appointment or they canceled it. Those are not prospective memory errors because they remembered that they had to do it and then they took care of it. So we really focus on the ones that were forgotten from that list, which is about 13%. And then, sorry, one more thing. There's also some survey research where they've asked parents of young children, how many times have you ever been driving and forgotten that your child was in the car at some point? And about 25% of parents report experiencing that at some point while they're driving their car with a young child in there.
Thank you. As you're talking about these prospective memory errors or the lack of remembering, are there factors that have been researched that have been determined to increase the likelihood that one of these errors would occur.
There have been.
Can you describe briefly what those factors are?
Yeah, so there's generally kind of 6 categories of these. And again, think back to what I explained earlier, that all of these are going to affect your ability to process what's going around, because they're going to draw upon resources in your brain. Okay? There's 2 kind of global ones, and that's sleep, lack of sleep disturbances, and stress, overall chronic stress. Those things are generally going to affect prospective memory. And then the other ones are more situational type of things, lack of retrieval cues, multitasking, divided attention. And then we have, hold on real quick, lack of attention, divided attention. Let me look at my notes really quick, sorry.
Dr. Cahill, if I
Yeah.
will, I'll ask you a question.
Yeah, sorry.
Is it, are there also factors such as variations from your usual routine that can affect or cause prospective memory errors?
Yeah, violating your routine.
What if you, would you consider being rushed or in a hurry a violation of your routine?
Yes.
Any other factors that you can think of that may affect someone or increase the likelihood of a prospective memory error?
Yeah, if I can look at my notes really quick, just to make sure. So those are the ones that I can think of right now.
We talked about prospective memory errors, and you mentioned things like, I forgot to stop at the store to get the milk, or I forgot to do this, and instead I went directly home. Those are pretty minor forgetfulness things. Is it possible for a prospective memory error to lead to catastrophic results?
Unfortunately, yes.
And could you describe for the jury some of the studies that have analyzed prospective memory errors that led to catastrophic results?
Yes, so there's several that we've applied it to. I'll talk about mainly airplane crashes. So one study got a hold of records for airplane crashes and looked at 75 of them to code what was the main cause of that crash. And 74 of the 75 were traced back to a prospective memory error of some kind. The other type was a retrospective memory error. So 74 of the 75 crashes were mainly caused by a prospective memory error.
So does that mean that someone, the pilot or someone, forgot to do something that they should have done in order to maintain the craft safety?
Correct. So in one example, the landing gear was not lowered because they were distracted doing something else while they were going through their checklist.
You mentioned checklists. Would the checklist be one of those retrieval cues that you would ordinarily think would help prevent a prospective memory error?
Yeah, so we know because of the research that these can be catastrophic in these kind of situations with airplanes specifically. So they have checklists and they have default things that pilots must go through, checklists to kind of make sure these things don't happen. And unfortunately, no matter what you do, we are human, and these things can occur even with the most due diligent person thinking ahead, having a checklist for pilots. We still have accidents. Even though it reduces it, we still have them.
And do prospective memory errors occur in other occupations?
They do. They've shown them in surgeries. Doctors have forgotten to remove surgical equipment from people, sewed them up with surgical equipment inside. Police officers going to the bathroom at movie theaters have forgotten to get their gun after they've taken it off to go to the restroom. Pharmacists have made errors, divvying out medication. You can go on and on. Any job with a human's working, you're going to have prospective memory errors.
When a person commits a prospective memory error, according to the research, do other people tend to attribute that to a dispositional factor or a situational factor? And before you answer that, please explain to the jury what I mean between dispositional and situational factors.
Sure. So think dispositional is character, and then situational is the environment. And then to answer your question, I would say yes, there is research to look at that. And I would say based upon the research, people tend to attribute behavior, prospective memory errors, to a dispositional factor rather than a situational factor.
And is that something that is studied in the field of science and is known as the fundamental attribution error?
That is correct.
Is that fundamental attribution error also a well-accepted concept in the field of psychology?
That is correct. Any social psychology class you take, any introductory psychology class you take is going to discuss the fundamental attribution error.
When people are analyzing or looking at other errors that people have made with memory, do the studies show that people tend to think that those sorts of things would never happen to them, or that they couldn't commit that kind of error?
I would say yes.
Could you give the jury an example of the fundamental attribution error and the dispositional versus situational concept so that it's more clear to them?
I'm sure. So we've all experienced this. You're driving down the road and someone cuts you off you may immediately kind of have that gut reaction of, oh, they're being inconsiderate. They're just cutting me off and they're not being nice about it, right? Instead of thinking about, well, maybe they're hurt and they're trying to get to the hospital, or their wife's giving birth, or whatever the case is, right? We would tend to jump to the conclusion that they're just being that way and that's who they are, versus the situation's driving their behavior more so.
We talked about the factors that have been shown by the research to increase the likelihood that a prospective memory error would occur, and you went through several of those. Have you had an opportunity to learn of information related to this case?
I have.
And did you, through your analysis, apply those factors or look for those factors in the case of Rhonda Jewell?
Yes, I did.
What information were you provided related to this case?
May I look at my notes for that?
Yes, please.
So I read the deposition of Brooke Page. I read the deposition of Stacey Pascal. I read the police report. I watched the interview of Rhonda Jewell. And I looked at some text messages that I received.
And in applying these factors to Ms. Jewell's case, let's go through them one by one, if we may.
Yes.
You mentioned that one of the big factors was sleep or sleep issues. Was that factor present in this case, to your knowledge?
Not to my knowledge, no.
What about the multitasking or divided attention?
Yes, that was.
And specifically in your analysis of the case, what sort of things are you talking about in that Ms. Jewell's attention was divided or she was multitasking?
Sure. So driving in and of itself is multitasking. So you're driving and you're at the same time trying to remember other things you have to do throughout the day. You're trying to make sure you don't get into a car accident. You're trying to see what the time is. Am I running late? All those kind of things. So that's all multitasking. Once she got to the house throughout the day, she's multitasking. She's babysitting 3 kids. And from what I read in the deposition, she was very attentive with the children. She played with them. So that's multitasking throughout the day, and that's going to continue that factor beyond the, yeah.
What about changes in the routine?
Yes, that's a big one, yeah.
What sort of changes in the routine were you aware of in this case?
So from my understanding, this was not the normal way for her day to start. It wasn't normal for her to have a RIA on this day. The schedule changed quite frequently. So that would throw things into a realm of increasing prospective memory error.
If it were normal for her to have a RIA on this Wednesday, but the timing was off, would that have increased the possibility that a prospective memory error occurred?
Yes, that's still throwing off the routine, yeah.
What if earlier in the week, hypothetically on Monday, she had a RIA but not the other children of Stacey's, which was a non-usual change? Would that have increased the possibility of a prospective memory error?
Based upon the empirical data, yes.
One of the things that you talked about was the lack of retrieval cues. You said that you mentioned that you saw some text messages related to this case. Specifically, I believe you saw the text messages between Rhonda Jewell and Brooke Page. Is that accurate?
Correct.
And I believe you were also provided a copy of the Snapchat message between Rhonda and Nevaeh Carter. Is that also correct?
Yes.
Usually, would you expect these text messages of this type to be a retrieval cue for a RIA?
I'm sorry, can you repeat the question?
Would these text messages have been a retrieval cue for a RIA, in your opinion?
I would say, in my opinion, they would not be a good retrieval cue for a RIA.
And why is that?
The RIA was not mentioned in the text messages or the Snapchat.
If it were evident that Brooke Page and Rhonda Jewell texted on a very frequent basis, would that decrease the likelihood that these particular texts would be a retrieval cue?
Absolutely.
Same question with regard to Nevaeh. If it were evident that Rhonda Jewell and Nevaeh Carter texted often or communicated often, would that decrease the likelihood that this Snapchat would be a retrieval cue?
Absolutely. As an example, if my son's grade school or daycare teacher texted me, the only time I talk to her is with my son in the context. So that would be a good retrieval cue. But if I talk to her every day about many, many other things, or not necessarily just every day, but regularly, that would not necessarily serve as a good cue for my son.
What about other retrieval cues? Was there generally a lack of retrieval cues on that particular day related to a RIA?
Based upon my review of the evidence, there were a lack of retrieval cues, yes.
And can you give the jury an example of what some of those may have been?
So a couple. So the diaper bag was in the back seat when she was driving, my understanding. And then when she got to the house and went inside, the diaper bag was still in the car. So there's no reminder of a RIA at the house when she was inside babysitting. Miss Pascal and I believe the daughter, I don't remember the daughter's name off the top of my head, but they did not know, if I remember correctly, that Araya was going to be there that day, so they didn't ask her. Usually they, from my understanding of the depot, they were very excited to see Araya and they would want to play with her and interact. And they didn't know she was coming that day, so they didn't do that. So those are two examples of that. And in general, retrieval cues are very, very, very important for memory. They may be the most important thing to trigger memory.
And I would assume that the studies would show that the stronger the retrieval cue is, the more likely is that it would trigger memory.
Correct. And then, yeah.
Okay. Does the factor of Rhonda Jewell's attention being divided and her being multitasking make it more likely that a prospective memory error occurred on July 19th?
Yes, it would.
Does the factor of lack of retrieval cues make it more likely that a prospective memory error occurred?
Yes, it would.
Does the factor of the changes in the routine of who she's keeping, when she's keeping them, where she's keeping them, does that factor make it more likely that a prospective memory error occurred?
Yes, it would.
If more than one of these factors is present, does it make it even more likely that a prospective memory error occurred?
Yes, it would. So in general, when you add these factors, they will exacerbate or make it more likely that something would happen. Let me give you a lay person's example for that, because that can be hard to understand. Let's take a hurricane. If we have a lot of wind, right, the chances of a tree falling down is good, but add 3 inches or 3 feet of rain on top of that, it's way more likely that the tree is going to fall down with the wind, right? That's what's happening here. You're adding one factor that increases the likelihood of the tree falling down, and you exacerbate that by adding this, and this factor. It creates a perfect storm for something like this to happen.
Dr. Cahill, if Miss Jewell remembers picking up the child on July 19th, remembers driving down the road, remembers that she considered stopping for breakfast for the other children, remembers driving on a state street, would that invalidate the statement that she forgot the child was in the car?
In my expertise, no.
Why not?
You're
Goes to credibility, vouching. Sir?
Go ahead, I'm sorry.
Oh, sorry, vouching for credibility. Objection.
Okay, I'll overrule that at this point.
You can answer, Dr.
Okay.
Cahill.
Let me gather my thoughts. So one thing, retrospective and prospective memory are two separate tasks. In general, we have a lot better retrieval cues for a retrospective task. By definition, when you're doing a retrospective task, for the most part, you're being asked, do you remember X? That fact right there is a retrieval cue. So it's going to help you remember that. Two, Miss Jewell has retold this story to police, to lawyers. She's run it over in her head, I would imagine, thought about it a lot. Recalling those over and over and over again, that's going to strengthen a memory. Anything you think about a lot generally will create a stronger memory trace, so you'll remember it better. That does not invalidate the fact that you could make a prospective memory, or you could certainly forget to do that and then remember everything else along with that. Just like when people recall memories in general, just because their reports are not consistent doesn't mean that they're inaccurate. That's how I'd answer that.
So does the fact that she remembers today those things using her retrospective memory mean that she couldn't have forgotten the child in the car?
Absolutely not.
So if you have a prospective memory error, does the person usually forget everything that's going on at that time, or just particular tasks?
I would say generally, no, it's the prospective memory error is forgetting to do that task. It doesn't mean that they are unable or not encoding the other things that they're doing at that time. In fact, maybe, I'm sorry to interrupt you. In fact, the more you're paying attention to what you're doing at that time may lead to even better memory of that, because you're giving your resources to that task and paying attention to that. So that could actually lead to better memory for what you're doing while you're forgetting to do something that you plan to do, if that makes sense.
So is it fair to say that what you mean is that the more focused you are on the other things, it's potentially more likely that you're going to forget the task that you have to remember in the future? Yeah,
because again, remember, prospective memory is a complex cognitive process that requires a lot of resources, and you're devoting those resources instead to that to do this other thing. It's not a conscious choice that you're doing that. You're just doing the task at hand. You're doing whatever you're doing now. And the more you do that, the more you pay attention to something, generally speaking, you're going to recall it better, the exposure time, basically.
If someone is extremely diligent, is there ever a time when prospective memory errors are always avoidable?
No, it's impossible. Even, like I talked about before with airplane pilots, surgery, we set things up because we know these errors are going to happen. Myself, I'm a memory expert. My wife never forgets to give me a hard time when I forget to do something that she told me to do, and brings up the fact that you're a memory expert. I thought you would never make this mistake. So no matter how diligent you are, we are going to make these kinds of errors. You can set up all the reminders you want necessarily. There can be situations when they don't occur. For instance, I had a reminder the other day to email a student, and at that time the reminder went off. A student walked into my office and got me distracted. I had to help that student, and I forgot to email that student back. So
The factors that we've talked about today that have been scientifically shown to increase the likelihood of forgetting something or a prospective memory error, the multitasking, divided attention, being hurried, lack of retrieval cues, changes in routines. In your professional opinion, do they support Rhonda's statement that she forgot Araya was in the vehicle?
yes, I would.
I have no further questions for the witness. Tender. Thank you, Dr. Cahill.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Cross-examination?
Thank you, Your Honor. Morning, Dr. Cahill.
Good morning.
You're a lecturing professor at the University of Florida, is that right?
My title is an associate instructional professor.
And you did your dissertation on eyewitness choosing behavior, the role of ekphoric experience, and non-memorial cues.
That is correct.
You did your master's thesis on the prevalence of ADHD, its subtypes, and comorbidity in adult prison inmates.
That is correct.
Looking over your CV that was introduced into evidence, it looks like you've done some professional peer-reviewed journals on witness accuracy in lineups. Is that correct?
Correct, among other things, yes.
Among the other ones, neuroimaging evidence of mock juror decisions,
Yes.
personality disorder profiles of incarcerated male rapists and child molesters.
Correct.
You've given professional talks to the Florida Association of Criminal Defense Lawyers. Yes?
Yes.
And wrongful conviction speaker series. You spoke there as well.
I believe that one, I organized that one. I can't remember if I actually spoke, but I organized one. If you're talking about the one at University of Florida, yes.
So prior to today, in this case, you've never testified about prospective memory in court. Is that fair to say?
That is correct.
Now, prospective memory, as you testified on direct, is talking about forgetting to do something you intend to do in the future.
Correct.
A fair way of saying it?
Forgetting to do something that you intended to do in the future, yep.
So I have two daughters. I always plan to remember their birthdays. If I forget their birthdays, that's an example of this prospective memory error.
Correct.
So this is something that is everyday life for every human being on the planet.
We all make these errors. Everybody in the courtroom can understand, know that we made these errors, yep.
So this isn't a medical affliction or like it's not amnesia or a stroke.
No. It's a result of normal cognitive processing, if anything.
Normal everyday life.
Correct.
I want to talk a little bit about the retrieval cues that you discussed with defense counsel. You said there were 6 categories, I believe, and correct me if I'm wrong. You said sleep, lack of sleep, stress, retrieval cues, multitasking, divided attention, and then violating a ritual routine. Is that correct?
Correct, yep.
So let's go through those. Lack of sleep, you said that didn't apply in this case, right?
Not from the information I was provided, no.
Okay. Stress. All people deal with stress. Is that a fair statement?
I don't know if all people deal with stress. People have stress. Everybody has stress, yes.
Fair way of saying it. Now, retrieval cues. Example of retrieval cue would be what? You gave some examples, but what would be the retrieval cues in this case?
For example, the diaper bag, or Aria's diaper bag would be an example.
And you said that diaper bag was not a retrieval cue in this case because why?
It wasn't a retrieval cue because when it was from my understanding, it was in the back seat of the car when she was driving, and then she went inside. So she may not have seen it there. And then when she's inside, she didn't take it inside. From my understanding, in the police report, I think it was that it was still in the back seat of the car, so it wasn't in the house with her throughout the day.
So you would agree with me that the defendant in this case could have taken the diaper bag and put it in the front seat if she was concerned about forgetting the child?
I don't know if I would agree with concern about forgetting the child. I would say she could have put it in the front seat instead of putting it in the back seat, but I don't know her motives behind that.
Dr. Cahill, what about a blanket? Would a blanket be a retrieval cue?
If it's Aria's blanket and it's, very related to her, then that could be a retrieval cue, sure.
Like this blanket?
I don't know. I've never seen it before. I mean, if that's Aria's, so if that's Aria's blanket and that's associated with her and that was with her all the time and they knew that and Mrs. Jewell knew that, then that could serve as a cue, yes.
So the defendant in this case could have put that blanket in the front seat to remind her.
She could have, yes.
How about the defendant seeing the victim's mother? Would that be a retrieval cue?
Seeing her mother, it depends on the context. I assume she sees her other times when Aria's not around, so.
How about if their habit and routine every time the defendant watches Araya, she picks Araya up from her mother? Every time, that's the way it happens.
So you're talking about Brooke. So every time, can you say that again?
Yeah, if the victim's mother, Brooke Page, and the defendant see each other, every time that the defendant watches Araya, would that be a retrieval cue, seeing Brooke?
If that's, yeah, that could be, yeah.
So if the defendant saw Brooke the morning of July 19th, that would be a retrieval cue that would link with watching the child.
Can you be more specific, seeing her where?
Picking up the child.
So when she was coming to pick up the child, yes, that can be a retrieval cue.
Now, with these memory failures, I want to talk a little bit about time. If I'm planning to stop and get milk, to use your example, and I'm driving from here to Miami, and I'm thinking, okay, I'm gonna when I get there, I'm gonna stop and pick up some milk, and I fail to do that. Versus the same scenario where I'm driving, say, 5 miles. All other factors are the same. There's a much more the probability of a prospective memory failure would be much less the shorter the drive. Is that fair?
So I would say every other condition being ideal, so no distractions, good retrieval cues, all that stuff. If you held all of that to optimal conditions, then yes, shorter retention interval will lead to less errors than longer retention interval.
Now, you'd agree with me that the categories we talked about a moment ago, the divided attention, the routine, the stress, the sleep, those are all things that the person who has the memory error controls.
No, I wouldn't agree with that.
Okay, so if divided attention, is it not the person's obligation to manage their own attention?
I have a 3-year-old and it's impossible for me to stop him from interrupting me and doing some work sometimes. So I would say that I can't control all those factors to make sure that I have undivided attention. My son doesn't understand at 3 to not bother dad while he's trying to do something. So he's going to keep bothering me until I pay attention to him, for instance.
In that scenario, as far as your attention, you have the ability to put your attention on what's most important, right?
But no, that's my point. Like we have things in the environment that will draw our attention and sometimes are out of our control. I cannot turn the TV on, for instance. I could turn my phone off, but sometimes other things I can't stop. So in the instance with the student coming in my office, I couldn't stop that student from interrupting me and causing me to make a prospective memory error. I can't tell students not to come by right then. It's office hours.
So if my attention is divided on the welfare of a child and a cell phone, can I not control how much attention I place on each?
Yeah, like I said, there are certain things you can dictate which draws your attention and not, but you can't ensure that all of my attention is always going to be geared here. Our mind wanders too. So it's impossible, no matter how much you try to focus on something, our mind after a while will start to wander off onto things, and we all experience this. You start to daydream, and then when you realize it, you're trying to bring your attention back, but you can't stop your mind from wandering at times. That's why I mean that they're not completely under the person's control at all times.
Okay, so if my obligation and my duty is to watch a child, are you saying that there's nothing I can do to make sure I'm watching that child? I can't focus my attention on that?
No, what I'm saying is that you can try to do your best there, but there are times when things in the environment will distract you or draw your attention away. Even your own cognitive system, it's limited. You can only focus and do so many things at once. You can't be perfect, is what I'm trying to say. It's impossible for anybody to be perfect. So
you'd agree with me that the defendant in this case was not perfect on July 19th, right?
yes, I would.
Dr. Cahill, you cannot say with any certainty whether there was a prospective memory error in this case, can you?
I can't get inside Miss Jewell's mind, no.
You didn't perform any testing of Miss Jewell. You didn't do any analysis of her speaking to her. Is that fair?
I did not know.
You mentioned some examples of, I think you said pilots as examples when you've dealt with studies on prospective memory.
Correct.
And you said something about pilots make checklists. Was that to prevent errors?
Yeah, from what I read in some of the studies I reviewed, they have checklists so that when they go through and they're doing something, it helps to prevent them from making errors.
Taking steps to ensure that they're doing the most they can.
Correct.
Now, on July 19th, you mentioned you reviewed some of the things that were going on for the defendant about her divided attention. What were those?
Rushing to get there in the morning, stopping at Burger King thinking that there's time and then there wasn't. Then when she gets to Miss Pascal's house, talking to Stacy, or babysitting the children throughout the day.
So the first one, rushing. The defendant rushing was her own choice. You'd agree with me there?
I don't recall the circumstances of why she had to rush that day, so I can't answer that, sorry.
Okay. You said stopping at Burger King. You'd agree with me that was her choice?
Deciding to stop, yes.
Getting out of the car and talking to Stacy, again, her choice.
Getting out of the car and going inside and talking to Stacy? Yeah, sure.
And after the defendant was there on July 19th, she received a text message from the victim's mother. And you said that would not be a retrieval cue. Why?
Because it's my understanding that they spoke regularly and that she didn't ask in the text message. I didn't see any mentioning of Aria in the message. Nothing about how is she doing? Did you get there safely? Things of that nature. She just texted her and it was something about, I believe it was Miss Pascal and the surprise of her leaving late, or not surprise, but the sarcasm that I'm not surprised that she left late.
They have a business relationship together. The victim's mother and the defendant have a business relationship together where the defendant watches this child multiple times a week. And a message from the victim's mother would not be a retrieval cue about Aria Page.
Again, I would say it's not a good retrieval cue because they talk regularly and not necessarily always about Aria.
You said good retrieval cue. You'd agree with me it's a retrieval cue.
No, it's not a good retrieval cue. It's not a retrieval cue to recall the memory that Aria was there and she had to get her out because they talk regularly and it wasn't about Aria, is what I'm trying to say.
15 minutes go by. The defendant picks up the child.
Mm-hmm.
The defendant goes to the house on Estate Street, roughly 15 minutes, and there's a text message. You're saying that would not be a cue of, oh, I just picked up Aria Page.
No, again, because they talk regularly. If the only way that they talk is because of Aria, like I gave the example of my day school, my daycare teacher, then that might serve as a retrieval cue. But the fact that they talk all the time and not about Aria every single time, in my opinion, based upon the research, does not necessarily serve as a retrieval cue.
May I have one moment, guy? Dr. Cahill, you'd agree with me that forgetting to do things we plan to do is part of the human condition.
Correct.
And that is something we all have to try to remedy.
Correct.
The brain has limits, is what it can do.
Yes.
So would you agree with me that someone can't blame forgetfulness when they fail to uphold their responsibility?
I don't know. Forgetfulness seems to me has a connotation with it, that there's intent in there. I don't know if I want to go down that road.
No other questions.
Redirect.
Thank you, Your Honor. Good morning again, Dr. Cahill.
Good morning.
Just a couple of things to clarify. The state brought up stress, and I don't think we had particularly identified stress. Were you aware of any extraordinary stress that Miss Jewell had going on at this time in her life?
I did. She had some trips planned, and one of her children was moving away to college. I would consider that stressful.
So extraordinary stress.
I was particularly moving away to college. Yes, as a parent, I would be very stressed with my child moving away.
The state showed you the picture of actually showed you Aria's baby blanket. If that baby blanket were in the car seat with Aria, would that have served as a retrieval cue if Rhonda Jewell had already forgotten Aria was in the car?
No, just if she didn't see it. In order for a retrieval cue to be effective, it has to be placed properly. So let me give you an example. My wife is horrible at turning off lights, drives me nuts. Right, so I try to. So let me give you an example. My wife is horrible at turning off lights, drives me nuts, right? So I try to tell her, sweetie, last night we were arguing, you forgot to turn the light off, right? So what I've done is I place Post-it notes at every door, leaving any room that reminds her. That fixes the problem because it's a good retrieval cue and she's going to see that whenever she leaves. My son took one of those down and put it down on the bottom of the baseboard. Now, even though it's there, she doesn't see it, so therefore she leaves the room, she forgets to turn the light off. It's the same kind of idea.
If Rhonda Jewell were not the person who placed Araya in the car or the backpack in the car, would she need a stronger retrieval cue to remember those things?
I would say in general, the more factors that draw upon resources in general, you need stronger retrieval cues. Weaker memories, things that are harder to do, you need better cues in general for them to work.
The state asked you a question about, well, she could have put the baby bag or the blanket in the front seat to remind her. Do people believe that they can have or create or be subject to these levels of catastrophic prospective memory errors?
Objection, Your Honor.
Sustained. The way it was phrased.
Based on your research and study of this field and the fundamental attribution error that we discussed earlier, has the study shown that what did the study show about people's thoughts related to whether this could happen to them, whether these catastrophic errors could happen?
So I would say in general, people at no fault of their own, it's a byproduct of how our brain works. We tend to be overconfident in most of the things that we do in our lives, right? There's lots and lots of research to support this. So we tend to underestimate the environment and these factors that will maybe lead us to errors. We tend to believe that we can overcome these things. So we may not do the things that we can do to take extra steps. And it's simply because of a byproduct of how our brain works. Take myself, I'm a memory expert. I know about these things and I still make the errors all the time. It's impossible for me to create and think of every cue I would need to make sure that I didn't commit this error. I can't think of everything in the environment that could happen. I can't foresee of every situation to do this to make sure that I never commit this error again, regardless of the significance of it. If it's forgetting to buy milk, which is obviously not significant, or forgetting Araya in the car, which is a very significant event. I can't think of everything that would stop me from making that error.
You mentioned that the pilots have checklists. Those checklists are there to encourage them to follow them so that there's not an error.
From my understanding, yes.
If a person, based on your knowledge of this field, if a person hadn't had this type of error happen before, would they make a checklist?
Can you repeat the question, sorry?
Sure. If on every other occasion a person had not committed an error of this level, would they create a checklist, or would they be overconfident that they're going to remember everything every time?
Yeah, so like most people, we change our behavior because there's consequences to that behavior. So when I forget to do something that's significant, I may try to undo things in the future to make sure that that same thing doesn't happen again. But if it hasn't happened to me, I'm going to be less diligent about it because I haven't had that error happen to me. And I would say that's true with anything. When I have a student miss an exam because they're late, they don't miss the next exam from being late because it hurts their grade really bad.
The state asked you the hypothetical about picking up milk 15 minutes down the road versus picking up milk 5 hours from now when you make it to Miami.
Yes.
I think your answer was that if all things are the same, nothing else is going on, you're going to be more likely to remember it the shorter driving distance, correct?
So I changed that a little bit. I would say if everything was ideal. So if there were no distractions, if the person had the resources, if there was good retrieval cues, all the opposite. So all the factors that increase prospective memory errors, if you kind of take the flip side of it, it's going to make it less likely to happen, right? So if everything's ideal, you hold all that constant in a good direction, then yes, longer retention interval means more errors. Shorter retention interval means it's less likely to happen. Doesn't mean that it can't happen. It just reduces the chances of it happening. But then you add other factors in there, and that could, how do I say this? It could negate the factor of retention interval. So for instance, if you make the person very, very, very distracted, it doesn't matter how long the retention interval is, they'll make an error right away. I could tell you to do something in 1 minute and distract you really badly, and you're a lot likelier to make that error just as much as if I did it in 20 minutes or an hour. So if I hold everything constant and it's ideal, then sure, you can make that argument.
And you would agree that driving is a divided attention task?
Absolutely.
If you're thinking about other things as you're driving and figuring out breakfast and trying to be on time, would those also be divided attention tasks?
Absolutely.
You mentioned and discussed divided attention, it sounded like as throughout the day of Rhonda Jewell's day. Is that accurate?
From my understanding of her day and Miss Pascal's deposition of how she was attentive with her children and how she babysat them and those kind of things, then yes, she was engaging in multitasking throughout the day, taking care of the children.
So would it be safe to say that she was multitasking and divided attention before she arrived at Stacy's house as well as after?
Yes, I would say before she got there, on her way there, and then after she got there, I would say she was engaging in multitasking in both of those situations.
You testified that you can't get inside the mind of Rhonda Jewell and say definitively that a prospective memory error occurred, that she forgot about Araya in the car. But was there any evidence that you saw that made you think that she had not forgotten Araya in the car?
Objection.
No.
Objection, Your Honor.
Sustained.
I have nothing further. Thank you, Your Honor.
Any other questions of this witness?
Very brief, Your Honor.
Okay, make it brief.
Dr. Cahill, I believe you just told defense counsel that people change their behavior because there are consequences to that behavior. Is that correct?
Generally speaking, yep, it's called operant conditioning, yes.
And you'd agree with me that paying attention to what is most important can affect what you remember?
More attention paid to something, generally speaking, again, everything else held constant, you can't, you can encode things in memory. If you don't pay attention to them, it gets complicated, but generally speaking, you pay attention to something, that's how you can store something into explicit memory where you can actually retrieve it. Okay, did I answer your question?
It does.
Okay.
So it's the person's choice what they're focused on, yes?
No, I wouldn't say it's a person's choice, no. There's things in the environment that can draw your attention that you're trying to focus here, but you get distracted and you can't pull it. I can get complicated here, but there's selective attention, there's divided attention. So you can try to focus on one thing, but you can get distracted even though you're trying to focus really hard here. You can get pulled away. There's factors that can pull you away. So I wouldn't say it's a person's decision whether or not to pay attention to this or not. They can try to pay attention to this, and they can try to give it as much of their attention, but that doesn't mean that they can't get distracted, and it's not, I'm choosing to get distracted, it just can happen.
But you would agree with me that people control what they are focused on?
People control what they're focused on to the extent that there's nothing else in the environment that distracts them. I can say right now I'm trying to focus on your questions as much as possible, but I just heard a thing outside, a lawnmower or something, and that distracts me. I can't stop that from happening. It's impossible.
But if the welfare of a child depended on your attention, you could try your best.
I can try my best, and yes, I can try my best.
No other questions.
Any other questions?
One last question, Judge.
One.
If the baby were quiet in the back seat and not making noise, would that also be a lack of retrieval cue?
Yes, it would.
Thank you.
Any other questions of this witness?
No other questions, Your Honor, and the witness is excused.
Okay.
Thank you. Thank you,
Doctor,
Dr.
you are excused.
Thank you, the court.
Thank you, sir. Would the defense call its next witness?
Your Honor, may we approach?
You may.
Wendy.
Thank you, sir. Counsel?
Dr. Diamond, are you a neuroscientist and professor at the University of South Florida?
That's correct.
How long have you been a neuroscientist?
I've been a neuroscientist now for about 40 years.
How long have you taught at the University of South Florida?
I've taught at USF for about 25 years.
In earlier testimony, you CD, is that correct?
That's correct.
And that CD is still accurate, correct?
Correct.
What would you define your field of study as?
Globally as the area of cognitive neuroscience.
And how would you describe that in layman's terms?
That's the understanding of how the brain processes information.
Have you ever done any research in the field of memory, prospective memory, or prospective memory failures?
So I've been studying memory all of my career, and in the past 20 years, I've focused on the brain and prospective memory.
Is prospective memory and prospective memory failures, are those widely studied in the scientific community?
Yes, that's correct.
How long have they been studied approximately?
Oh, quite a few, multiple decades.
So you study the brain and how the brain processes memory, is that correct?
That's correct.
Can you tell me what parts of the brain are involved in memory, prospective memory and prospective memory failures?
So there are two primary areas of the brain involved in prospective memory. The first is we make a plan to do something in the future. So prospective memory is to remember to do something in the future. So you make that plan using your frontal cortex. You use your hippocampus, which is our primary memory structure, to form that memory of what you plan in the future, and then to actually have that memory occur, to reactivate. And so you need for your hippocampus to be active at just the right time for when you're planning to do whatever it is in the future.
Is there any other brain structure involved in prospective memory or their failures?
Well, we have another brain structure called the basal ganglia. And the basal ganglia can interact with the hippocampus and frontal cortex and can compete with the hippocampus frontal cortex. The basal ganglia has us do something automatically. And so if we're always, for example, driving from home to work, it's our basal ganglia that allows us to do that almost without thinking about it.
Is that also something associated with habit memory?
Right. So the basal ganglia underlies habit memory, what we call muscle memory, being able to do something automatically without thinking about it.
Do these brain structures normally interact with each other on a daily basis?
Well, these brain structures can be quite compatible, allowing us to do things automatically, the basal ganglia, allowing us to remember information, hippocampus, and plan for the future. But when we're talking about prospective memory, we've got the frontal cortex and hippocampus have a plan. But the basal ganglia can override that plan, and it can have us do something out of habit, which then causes a prospective memory failure.
Are prospective memory failures common?
It's one of the most common forms of memory failures. It's prospective memory.
And you indicated you've spent at least 20 years researching this area, correct?
That's correct.
Would you be able to provide testimony to a jury about how the brain functions, how prospective memory works, and how the failures thereof occur?
Yes, I would be able to talk about the different brain structures, how they interact, how they enable prospective memory to occur successfully, but also how it can fail.
You've testified before in cases involving memory, prospective memory, and those failures, correct?
That's correct.
You've also consulted before in cases involving those things as well.
That's correct.
You've consulted for both the defense and the prosecution in different cases, correct?
I've advised both defense and the prosecution.
You prepared a PowerPoint presentation in this case, is that correct?
Yes.
Would that PowerPoint presentation assist you in explaining your testimony to a trier of fact?
I think it would provide a constructive visual aid.
Dr. Diamond, do you know how many other people are studying the area of prospective memory and those failures?
Oh, this is a very widely studied area. There must be hundreds, maybe thousands of other scientists studying prospective memory.
As far as the research that has gone into prospective memory and those failures, are there numerous articles written by experts in your field about that issue?
Certainly, articles have been written over decades about this phenomenon.
Now, in this case, you would be testifying about prospective memory failure as it relates to a child who died in a hot car. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Is the field of prospective memory failures as it relates to children in hot cars, is that a specific field or just applying prospective memory analysis in the field of study to factual situations involving children dying in hot cars?
So prospective memory covers a broad range of different kinds of memory failures. Children being forgotten in cars is one category of prospective memory.
Have you published on prospective memory and its failures, generally speaking, over the years?
Yes, I have an online article which has over 100,000 views, specifically about the brain and prospective memory failures, and I published in a peer-reviewed medical journal on the neurobiology and neuropsychology of prospective memory failures.
Have you published anything about prospective memory failures in relationship to hot car child deaths?
Yes, specifically, my peer-reviewed medical journal paper addressed children dying in hot cars.
I think last time you testified at the hearing, I think we introduced that document. Is that correct?
Correct.
And that's been peer reviewed, correct?
Correct.
Has your work in the area of prospective memory failures and those failures relates to hot car child deaths been, excuse me, cited in other experts' work?
Yes, I've seen that. It's been viewed hundreds of times. It's specifically been cited in quite a few journals addressing both the issue of children forgotten in cars as well as the science of children forgotten in cars.
And these journals, if you broadly describe, are journals in the field of memory, prospective memory?
Yes, these are journals in the field of psychology as well as neuroscience. I wonder if I might get some water.
Dr. Diamond, I'm going to ask you to turn around and look at a slide from your PowerPoint. Okay. Give you a minute. Can you see the top of it, or here you go.
Just may I clarify? I received a couple of different PowerPoints. The last one I said corrected, so can we just confirm what PowerPoint it is? And I just want to make sure I have the same copy.
I sent Mr. Caldo the corrected one this morning. You should have it.
The last one.
The last one, yes. Dr. Diamond, can you tell me what that slide is from your PowerPoint?
So this is a publication, as you can see how long prospective memory has been studied from over 20 years ago, in which the scientists are interested in how rapidly prospective memory can fail. And so these subjects are brought into a laboratory under controlled conditions, and they're given a task, which is to do something such as mental arithmetic. And then they're shown a cue. When they see that cue, they have to remember it. And at the end of performing their task, which is only 40 seconds later, they just need to hit a key on the keyboard. So the idea in prospective memory is you have to do something in the future. You have to remember to do something in the future. And under the control condition, which is the open bar, these people remember it 90% of the time. That's what that 0.9 is. Now, what they've also done with these people is on a subset of trials, they've added a distraction. Briefly, they need to do something else during that 40-second period. And then they ask, do you remember, after seeing that red mark, do they remember to hit the key on the keyboard? And that's the lower bar. That's the one with the diagonal lines. It shows significantly reduced incidents in which people remembered to hit the key on the keyboard. And the really important point about this paper is that it shows a very brief distraction causes people to have a PM failure, prospective memory failure, that is now down to only 60% accurate.
Is this an example of testing that's done on prospective memory and failures of prospective memory, correct?
That's correct. This is just one of many papers that have tested prospective memory and its failure. The emphasis here is how rapidly people forget what was in their plan.
This is one example of the testing that's been done regarding prospective memory and its failures, correct?
That's correct.
Just a moment. Judge, at this point, I've asked the court to reconsider its decision not to allow Dr. Diamond to testify in this case. We'd ask the court to.
Well, does the state first wish to make any inquiry of the doctor?
Judge, I'll ask a few inquiries.
You want to be? Oh,
Okay. On your PowerPoint slide, if we go to the first page. The title there, can you just read the title of your PowerPoint presentation?
Neuropsychological perspective of how it is possible to forget a child in a car in relation to state of Florida versus Rhonda Jewell.
Is it safe to say that the title of your presentation is the bulk of the sum and substance of what you're testifying to? Is that fair to say?
That's correct.
Okay. If we go to the last slide. And it would be your intention to testify to the items that are in your slide and present them to the jury?
Well, as a scientist, I like to summarize my work. My intention would only be what would be permitted in the court.
Fair. Can you go ahead and read the last paragraph on the last page?
Like other loving and attentive parents and caretakers, Rhonda Jewell unintentionally and unknowingly lost awareness of Araya in her car.
It's fair to say that that would be potentially within the scope of your testimony today at the trial. Is that fair to say?
That's correct.
In preparation for today, are you at all familiar with Dr. Cahill's testimony in this case?
I was not here while he gave testimony.
Did you get a copy of his prior deposition?
Yes, I did.
And are you familiar with that deposition?
Yes, I am.
Okay. And same thing with this hearing. Are you familiar with what he testified to in general at his hearing?
I received one document, which may very well have been his hearing.
Which may have been a transcript from the hearing?
Yes.
Okay. Are you familiar that he testified? Okay, I thought Your Honor said something plausible. To me means that I cannot say with any confidence whether or not leaving a riot page in the car was because of prospective memory error. Are you aware that that's his testimony?
Yes.
Okay. And do you agree with that testimony?
Well, as a scientist, one has to be open to any possibility, no matter how unlikely.
Okay. So if I asked you to whether or not you disagree with that statement, what would your response be?
Based on my interview with Rhonda Jewell and what I read about her from other depositions, I would disagree with him that she committed this act intentionally.
We renew our request, Judge.
I've heard your argument. Any argument?
Just we rely on all of our prior motions, arguments, everything else we raised, and now it's duplicative.
Okay, well, with due respect to Dr. Diamond, I'm going to continue to exclude his testimony for the reasons that were set forth in the written order that was entered sometime back in September, and for the further reason that the court has allowed the testimony of Dr. Cahill, who also is an expert in the field of prospective memory. So,
Judge, I'd just like to perfect the record a few more minutes if I can. I'd like to perfect the record a few more minutes with some more testimony, just for the record.
what I don't see any need for it, but if you want to do it, yeah.
Yes, sir. Thank you. Dr. Diamond, in this particular case, you had a chance to look at the facts of this case. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Now, in general, can prospective memory have catastrophic effects?
Yes, it can.
Have there been studies of airlines and other things that would indicate that?
That's correct. Planes crash as a result of prospective memory failures.
Do you, in your field of study, use surveys to help analyze prospective memory and failures of prospective memory?
Yes, I do.
What is a survey, generally speaking?
So at a survey, you're looking for a representative group of people. You can ask them questions that can provide some insight to understand a phenomenon.
I approach the witness, Judge.
Any questions? Can Dr. Diamond be excused? Oh, okay, I'm sorry, I thought you were through.
Dr. Diamond, I'm going to show you a document. Tell me if you recognize what that is.
Yes, I recognize this. This is a survey of over 1,000 parents with young children. These are also caregivers, yes. That's right, parents and caregivers, all of whom transport children 6 and under.
Can you generally speak an overview of what that survey says?
As far as to me, the most important feature of this survey is that they found that almost all, 88% of these people said that they can't imagine that they would never leave and forget a child in a car.
Is that something that experts like yourself rely upon and find and having opinions about this?
Yes, I find that information very useful.
The surveys are a common way to gather information.
That's correct.
I'd like to move this into defense number 2.
Any objection?
No, sir.
Then it will be received as Defense Exhibit 2 for the proper purpose.
Judge, just want to be 1,000% sure that doesn't end up back in the jury.
Right, by all means.
Doctor, can you give us an example of how habitual memory action can override conscious intentions?
Well, we have these kind of experiences on a regular basis. You have the intention of, first you have a normal drive home from work. And on a particular drive, you have a plan to stop at the pharmacy to pick up some important medication. So that's now a prospective memory. On your drive, you follow the route that you have gone hundreds, maybe thousands of times. And you drive right past the pharmacy, you end up at home. The failure to remember the plan, to stop at the pharmacy, is a failure of prospective memory. That is when your habit memory overrides your prospective memory. That is when your basal ganglia, the brain structure that controls habit memory, overrides the hippocampus, which has the responsibility to remind you to stop at the pharmacy.
In the PowerPoint presentation that you would have used had you testified in this case, you have slides, explanations of these kinds of things, correct?
Correct.
There are also some studies in your slides regarding the number of children left in cars, correct?
That's correct.
And that's done by the Pediatric Association?
Well, it's done through a few different organizations, kidsincars.org, noheatstroke.org, as well as newer organizations that maintain a database of the number of children that die in hot cars.
Again, these are things that you use in your field of study, correct?
That's correct.
One particular study from 2024 from the Traffic Injury Prevention Coalition, they talk about what they refer to as PVH, which is pediatric vehicular heat stroke. That's the same thing as a child dying in a hot car, correct?
Correct.
Do you recall what they found in that study?
Well, what they found is that approximately an average of about 30 to 40 children per year die of heat stroke as a result of being forgotten in cars over the past 25 years.
Do they discuss in this article how that occurs?
Well, they use my research to discuss how that occurs, specifically citing my research with an entire paragraph covering my research.
This is the research that you documented in your article that was introduced several months ago in a hearing, correct?
Right. They cited my peer-reviewed publication with an extensive discussion of my findings to explain how it is that prospective memory fails, specifically with children forgotten in cars.
Dr. Diamond, in this case, you came to a conclusion about what you believe happened in this case. Is that correct?
That's correct.
What information did you have prior to making that conclusion?
I interviewed Mrs. Jewell. I watched the video of her when she was being questioned. I also read depositions. I read the police report to come to my conclusion.
So what's your understanding of what occurred in this case that would have caused a prospective memory failure for Mrs. Rhonda Jewell?
So Mrs. Jewell had a habit, her routine for several months was to go straight to Stacy Paschal's house. From her house to Stacy Paschal's house, take care of her children. That routine changed.
I'm going to ask you to look behind you here. We're going to pull up a slide here from your PowerPoint. The slide that's currently on the screen, could you tell us what that is?
So this is a visual that I use to help to understand someone's habitual performance, their habit memory. So what you have here is the route that Miss Jewell took from her home to Stacy Paschal's home, which she followed for several months. So this became part of her habit memory.
And that's the basal ganglia, correct?
And this is ultimately controlled by the basal ganglia, which allows you, again, to go on a route without thinking about it. And it's this motor memory that we talk about.
And the next slide we're going to show you, can you tell us what that is?
So things changed. When in June, she picked up Araya on the way to Stacy Paschal's home, which ended up actually on the same street, 6th Street. So she's now changed her route for a relatively short period of time for a few weeks. So she now has a new route to follow, which overlaps with the old route.
And the next slide that we have.
So things now changed on the week of July 12th. And now it's become different almost every day. So on July 12th, Ms. Jewell did not go to Stacy Paschal's house. She picked up Araya and then returned to her home where she watched Araya. So she's now got a different route.
And the next slide that we have,
Now we're back to the routine route. That's July 13th. She's once again back to the route that she followed for months because Araya was not available to her that day. So on that day, she did not take care of Araya. She went straight to Stacy Paschal's house, reactivating that old habitual memory.
and the next slide that we have, Doctor.
Things have now changed again. On the following Monday, she has now picked up Araya and has not gone to Stacy Paschal's house. She's gone to a friend's house where she has now watched Araya for the day.
And the next slide that we have.
So on Wednesday, July 19th, we're now back to Mrs. Jewell picking up Araya with the plan then to bring her to Stacy Paschal's house. During that drive, there was a good bit going on. It was a rather stressful morning. She had planned on going to Burger King. She was in a bit of a hurry. And as she then left the Burger King, as she reported to me, she lost awareness of Araya in the car. So she then gets back on 6th Street and goes to Stacy Paschal's house.
And the next slide that you have.
This illustrates that in the process, now as she's driving on 6th Street, coming to Stacy Paschal's house, that component of the slide that included Araya has faded. It has now faded from her memory. She arrived at Stacy Paschal's house, no longer being aware of Araya in the car. And so when she exited the car, she had lost awareness of Araya.
You use your phrase here, unknowingly and unintentionally, on the slide behind you. What do you mean by that?
So we distinguish intentional acts from unintentional acts without knowledge. So at the moment, we can query what is going on with Rhonda Jewell. Is she aware of Araya in the car? The answer is no. Is she intending to leave her in the car? The answer is no. So it is an unknowing and unintentional act to leave this child in the car.
When you say lost awareness, are you saying that she forgot that Araya was in the car?
Yes, she did forget that Araya was in the car. The addition of talking about awareness helps to explain why she forgot.
And so the events that you described just in the last few moments, are those things that have occurred in your research to other individuals, this loss of awareness?
Yes, I personally have handled dozens of cases in which children have died in hot cars. And there is such a consistent pattern in which the parent or caretaker has had a routine drive that does not include the child. And so at the time in which they have gone to their destination, to them, this is a drive that does not include the child. They have lost awareness of the child. This is what every parent, and I'm talking about dozens of parents and caretakers, have reported to me. They thought they were on a routine drive. And as far as the child, they had lost awareness of the child. So when they exited the car, they were not aware the child was in the car.
A couple last things really quick. I haven't shown you the entire slide, PowerPoint, excuse me, but you've reviewed that, correct?
The entire PowerPoint?
Yes.
Yes.
I mean, you produced it.
Yes.
I've shown you some. Are those accurate from your PowerPoint presentation?
Yes.
And the flash drive that you gave me that contained that would contain the entire PowerPoint presentation you wanted to present if you testified in this case. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Because we're going to ask the court to let me move into evidence for purposes of proper PowerPoint presentation.
Any objection?
Again, same, just, as long as they're not going back there.
I will go ahead and receive it as Defendant's Exhibit 3 for proffer purposes only.
And the last thing, Dr. Diamond, if you were to testify in this case, would you testify that in your expert opinion, that Rhonda Jewell lost awareness or forgot that Araya was in the car by the time she arrived at Stacy Paschal's home?
Yes, I would testify to that.
I have no other questions, Your Honor.
The state has indicated it has no questions of Dr. Diamond. Can he be excused at this point?
Yes, sir. We're going to ask the court to reconsider and have him testify.
Same ruling.
Thank you.
Okay, Dr. Diamond, you are excused. Thank you, sir. Got everything? Okay, it is about 5 minutes to 12 or so. Time for the lunch break. Is the defense going to announce rest at this point? We'll have you announce it again when the jury comes in.
We will announce rest at this time, Your Honor.
Very well. What we'll need to do, I assume you will want to renew your motion
Yes, sir.
before we bring the jury in, but we'll take our lunch break, come back, hear your motion, and then